trial of Fiona Gray, accused of burning down her husband's house in the exclusive Coldwater Valley outside Fulchester, today enters its final stages. The defence so far has concentrated on Mrs. Gray's state of mind at the time she fired the bungalow, and has tried to show that she was in a condition of automatism, that is to say, unaware of what she was actually doing and therefore not responsible for it. Under cross-examination, a psychiatrist who treated Mrs. Gray has had to admit that both Mrs. Gray's adultery with Gilbert Brinsley, an art tutor, and the firing of the house were extreme reactions to stresses imposed on her by her life as an immature wife and mother, condemned to a kind of enduring childhood. However, the accused, Fiona Margaret Gray, has now been called to give evidence.
What is your religion?
Church of England.
Take the testament in your right hand and read aloud the words on the card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Fiona Margaret Gray, and at present you're living with your sister at 23 Argyle Street, Fulchester.
Yes.
Now, don't be afraid to speak up, Mrs. Gray. The jury wants to hear everything you have to say.
Yes. Yes, I'm sorry.
Now, Mrs. Gray, you're accused of having burned down your home at number 7 Adelaide Close, where you lived with your husband and 2 children. Now, can you tell us, is there any truth in these accusations?
I suppose there must be.
Now, what does that mean exactly? Yes?
It's just... people say I did it, don't they? Bobby says she saw me do it. Bobby from next door. Rick's in, no doubt, so I suppose I must have done.
So you're not really very clear in your mind about it even now? You're still confused?
I tried to say it to Dr. Coe when I saw her. If I burned Rick's house down, I've just no idea why.
Now, Rick's house, you always regarded the bungalow as Rick's exclusive property, did you? Mrs. Gray, can you remember anything of what happened on June the 28th?
I remember Rick was late. Yes. It had been an awful day, really. Because just that morning I'd told Rick of... well, a very stupid mistake I'd made, and he'd threatened divorce. I didn't know whether he was serious or if it was just another row. We'd had a lot of rows about that time. Blazing, idiotic rows. Rick wouldn't consider me, you see. Not properly. He'd neglect me, then expect me still to be a nice little wife to him. It was his marriage, not mine.
Mrs. Gray, this stupid mistake you said you made, what was that?
Oh, that was my affair with Gilbert Brinsley, the art tutor. Yes, I can't remember exactly why it happened now.
Was it a love affair, Mrs. Gray? Did you love Gilbert Brinsley?
No. Oh, no. That's what makes it so extraordinary. We had practically nothing in common.
Had you ever been unfaithful to your husband before, Mrs. Gray?
No, never in my life.
Then why this time? Surely there must have been some particular reason.
Well, I can't remember exactly. I was in a pretty bad state of mind when it happened. I remember even when it did happen, it seemed unreal. And afterwards I couldn't, well, get it in perspective. But then Gilbert expected things of me, and I had to go on.
You were seduced, in other words, were you, Mrs. Gray? A man who was attracted to you took advantage of your depressed mental condition.
Yes.
Did you feel guilty about the affair?
Oh, yes, very guilty. It got to be a pressure, in fact, building up inside me. You see, the reason I'd been depressed in the first place was because I asked Rick to put the family home in my name as well as his, and he refused. That hurt me very much.
But why, Mrs. Gray? Why hurt you? Why precisely was it so important to you to have the family house in your name as well as your husband's?
I'm not sure now. The house, well, it's the centre of your life, isn't it? You've got to feel it's yours, or you hate it.
Mrs. Gray, at a certain stage in your affair with Gilbert Brinsley, you put a certain suggestion to him concerning your husband's house.
Yes, sometime in June, I asked him if he'd help me destroy it by fire.
Now, why, Mrs. Gray? Why destroy it, and why by fire?
Mrs. Gray, it would help your case considerably if you could answer those 2 questions. You see, throughout this hearing, these 2 things have puzzled me. Why, no matter what your state of mind, you should have conceived the idea of destroying your husband's property, and then why you should want to do it by burning it down. Now, can you tell us anything at all that will help us?
Very well, Mrs. Gray. Let's consider something else, shall we? Your children were in the house when you lit that fire. Were you aware of that?
I don't know. I can't remember.
Well, you'd apparently just put them to bed before you lit the fire because Terence was still reading. Now, you don't recollect anything about that?
No.
As the flames shot out of the garage door, your neighbour, Mrs. Helder, asked you about the boys, and you apparently said to her, "They're not my children, Bobby, they're his."
Yes, that's right.
You do remember saying those words?
No. What I mean is, I understand how I could have said such a thing. It seems it was the way my mind had been going for a long time.
You'd really come to the conclusion that the children were more your husband's than your own, you mean?
It wasn't quite like that.
Well, how was it, Mrs. Gray?
Well, I'd come to believe they'd simply be better off as his. I wasn't reliable anymore, you see. I seemed to be such a mess.
And that was what you were implying when you said to Mrs. Helder, "They're not my children, Bobby, they're his"? Where are the boys now, incidentally, Mrs. Gray?
Oh, they're with my husband for the time being, at his mother's place.
Do you see them?
Yes. Oh, yes, whenever I want to.
Why aren't they with you, Mrs. Gray?
I didn't want that just now.
Why not?
I thought all this should be cleared up first. I mean, I am a mess, aren't I? I didn't know what mightn't happen. I might even try to hurt them again. By all accounts, I as good as killed them that night.
Mrs. Gray. Mrs. Gray, when your neighbour, Mrs. Helder, took you into her house that night, she heard you say, "Now he'll never love me, never again. I've destroyed his precious house and he'll punish me." Now, do you recall using words like that?
No. No, I don't.
Mrs. Gray, what do you think you might have meant by those words if it were impressed upon you that you did use them?
I really haven't the faintest idea.
Mrs. Gray, could those words refer to your husband? Did he punish you? Were you expecting your husband to strike you, Mrs. Gray?
No answer. Well, Estate?
No further questions, my lord.
Mr. Lloyd?
Well, Mrs. Gray, you seem to have answered some of the questions my friend has put to you, but then, of course, she has left out the important ones. I want to ask you a few questions about your relationship with your husband. When was it you ceased loving him, precisely?
What?
I said, when was it you ceased loving your husband? Plainly, there was a time after your marriage when you were in love, and then later...
But I never stopped loving Rick. Never.
Well, it has been testified that you used to criticise him publicly
yes,
and make
but that
excessive
doesn't mean-
demands on him. And we've even heard from Mr. Gray himself that at a certain point you made it quite clear you wanted nothing more to do with him in a sexual way. Is that true, Mrs. Gray?
Well, I didn't say as much, if that's what you mean. It just happened that way.
Why?
Sometimes in life you realize the way things have to be. I didn't hate Rick. I didn't even turn against him, as he's saying now. I simply knew that sort of relationship didn't make sense for us anymore.
That still isn't a reason, Mrs. Gray.
Well, then there isn't one. Goodness, I don't have to stand here answering ridiculous questions like this, do I? Any more than I had to answer that doctor's ridiculous questions about my childhood. My childhood was a marvellous time. By and large, I had a good marriage with Rick, too. If he thought I was cold, then it was his business to do something about it, wasn't it? That's a husband's duty, to cherish his wife. A wife has to respect her husband.
Respect, Mrs. Gray.
Yes, I always respected Rick. He can't deny it. And I worked hard, looking after his family. What more did he want?
Well, then can you tell the court why it was you got Gilbert Brinsley to try and burn your husband's house down?
Why?
Yes, we've heard a great deal of endless vague talk about whether you knew what you were doing when you burnt down the house yourself, but nothing about why at an earlier point you attempted to co-opt a partner in this crime.
I can't remember exactly. I was in a pretty bad state of mind. I suppose I wasn't very serious
You were
about it.
serious enough to form a comprehensive plan.
I'm sorry?
Mr. Brinsley has testified that the notion was that you would get your husband and children out of the house on Sunday and that he would then set fire to it on your behalf.
Well...
Who would be guilty of arson then, Mrs. Gray? You or Mr. Brinsley?
Look, it's absurd.
It's a good thing that
honestly
Mr. Brinsley thought it was absurd, as he'd have found himself in the dock today instead of you. Was it not in order to get him to burn the house down that you seduced him?
I didn't seduce him.
Now, another thing. You tell us that when you said to Mrs. Helder, they're not my children, Bobby, they're his, what you meant was that you'd come to look on yourself as unable to act responsibly as their mother any longer.
Yes, that's true. I would have meant something like that.
Oh, yes, of course, would have meant. For you don't remember very clearly, do you? You were acting automatically at the time.
I suppose I must have been, yes.
Yet you recognise Mrs. Helder. You called her Bobby. You recognise your husband moments later, and to his question, what have you done now? You replied, it's what you wanted, isn't it? The finish between us. I've done you a favour. And that was clearly a reference back to your argument of earlier that morning, which you'd remembered there in the middle of your blind, unconscious state.
Perhaps I was coming back to normal then. You can't tell.
Oh, please. The fact is you weren't in a trauma at all, were you, Mrs. Gray? You hated your husband for stating he was seeking a divorce, and you set fire to the house to be revenged on him.
No!
Well, what else? Just as earlier, you'd attempted to get Gilbert Brinsley to do the same thing for you. That is a declaration of intent, Mrs. Gray. It is a declaration of intent.
That's a dreadful accusation to make. I wouldn't put my children at risk. No woman
Your
would.
children, your husband's children.
I've explained
No,
about
you
that.
haven't. You actually once told Mrs. Helder that you thought you hated them.
Oh, you don't understand. Nobody does. Why do you go on at me? He was a hard man. So severe. I tried to make him love me, but it was no use. And that day he found me with the matches. He was so cruel. For my own good, he said. My own good. But he was cruel. Savage.